So 2.4 goes over quadratic equations and solving them. There's different ways to solve these quadratic equations. Today in part 1, we're going to focus on solving them by factoring. So with any of these equations, you're going to want to make sure that they are set equal to 0 and then just factor. You should by now know how to factor since we've been doing this since the beginning of the year. In example 1a, you're given 6x squared is equal to 3x. With this one, you got an x squared, so you want everything on the same side with that x squared. So we're going to move that 3x over by subtracting it from each side. That's going to give us 6x squared minus 3x is equal to 0. Now, you'll probably look at this and say there's not 3 terms on the left side, there's only 2. So how am I going to factor that? Well, they have a greatest common factor. So you're going to look to see what their greatest common factor is and factor that out. Their greatest common factor is 3x, so we're going to factor out the 3x to give us 3x times 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. You are completely factored from this point. So when you are completely factored, you are going to set each part equal to 0 and solve. So the parts that we have here are the 3x and the 2x minus 1. You're going to set the 3x equal to 0. You're going to set the 2x minus 1 equal to 0. And you're going to solve both of these. For the 3x is equal to 0, divide each side by the 3, and you get that x is equal to 0. For the 2x minus 1 is equal to 0, move your 1 over first, add it to both sides. You have 2x is equal to 1. Then you're going to divide each side by the 2 to get that x is equal to 1/2. So you have 2 solutions here. And because you don't have denominators with that x in it, you don't need to necessarily check them. However, if you do check them, just plug them back in to the original equation. You should get true statements if they are your answers. For example B, you have 9x squared minus 6x is equal to -1. For this one, we're going to move the 1 over first. So we're going to add it to both sides. This is going to give us 9x squared minus 6x plus 1 is equal to 0. Before you factor, ask yourself if you have a greatest common factor. In this case, you don't, so you're going to factor this like usual. Since your a is something other than 1, you could multiply your a and your c term, find the factors that replace your b, then factor by grouping. However, this is a perfect square trinomial, which means, so that means that you're going to take the square root of the first term, which is 3x, take the square root of the last term, which is 1, multiply it by a -2 since the middle term is negative. That gives you that -6x. So this factors to give you 3x minus 1 to the second power is equal to 0. This is also 3x minus 1 times 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. So if you set both of these equal to 0 and solve them, you're going to get the same answer for both of them. So you don't necessarily have to do that. You can just use the one of them because they're both the same and solve. So with this, you'd add your 1 over. You have 3x is equal to 1. Then divide each side by the 3. And you have that x is 1/3. All right, so for our next example, we have 4x squared is equal to 12. Now, with this one, again, we have an x squared and not all of our terms are on the same side. However, you can get that x squared by itself since your other term does not have an x attached to it, which means we can use square roots in order to solve this. So, by doing this, we're going to divide each side by the 4 to start with. And this is only done because you have an x squared and you have a constant, so a number that does not have an x attached to it on both sides of that equal sign. So that's going to leave you with x squared is equal to 3. From here, we would take the square root of both sides, and x is going to equal the positive and the negative square root of 3. For the examples like B and C, you have a binomial squared is equal to a number but doesn't have a variable attached to it. So with these, that binomial squared is isolated. You're going to take the square root of both sides and then solve for x. So for B, you have this x minus 3 squared is equal to 7. If you take the square root of both sides of that equal sign, We have x minus 3 on the left side because the square root has the same index as the power and they cancel each other out. And then that square root of 7 is just plus or minus the square root of 7. Your whole idea is to get x by itself, and it's not by itself right now. It's being subtracted with that 3. So that 3 has to move over, so add it to both sides. Because it is the real part and it's not irrational, you're going to put that 3 in front of the plus or minus the square root of 7. So that's going to give you x is equal to positive 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. Your x is by itself, so that's your answer. For example C, we have 2x minus 1 squared is equal to 9. Or sorry, negative 9. For this one, your binomial squared is by itself. It's equal to a constant. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. With this one, however, you do have a negative underneath that square root. So that negative has to come out, represent with an I. You also have to remember the plus or minus in front of that. So you're going to cancel out the power on the left side to give you 2x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus I square root 9. The square root of 9 is 3, so that gives you plus or minus 3i. From here, we get x by itself. So we're going to first move the 1 over by adding it to both sides. That gives us 2x is equal to 1 plus or minus 3i. From there, we divide each side by the 2. And we have x is equal to 1 plus or minus 3i all over 2. For our next examples, we're just solving by factoring, by grouping. So with these, you have 4 terms on the same side of that equal sign, and none of those 4 terms are like terms. So you're going to use your grouping or factoring by grouping in order to solve these. For example A, you have x cubed plus 3x squared minus 4x minus 12 is equal to 0. You're going to put parentheses around the first 2 terms, put parentheses around the last 2 terms. With the first 2 terms, you have a greatest common factor between both of those as x squared. With the last 2 terms, you have a greatest common factor of negative 4. So this is going to give you x squared times x plus 3 minus 4 times x plus 3 is equal to 0. From here, your 2 parentheses that are left over are identical to one another. So we're going to leave that as x plus 3. And then form another with the x squared and the minus 4. Now that x squared minus 4, you have an x squared in there and you have a constant. So you could set that equal to 0 and solve. Or you can still factor it. It's up to you. I'm going to continue by factoring. So if I factor that, that is a difference of squares. So it's going to give me x plus 3 times x plus 2 times x minus 2 is equal to 0. Now that I'm completely factored, I'm going to set each part equal to 0 and solve. So that's going to give us x plus 3 is equal to 0, x plus 2 is equal to 0, and x minus 2 is equal to 0. From here, I'm just going to get x by itself for all 3 of these equations and solve. For the x plus 3 is equal to 0, I'm going to subtract 3 over. That gives me x is equal to negative 3. For the x plus 2 is equal to 0, I subtract the 2 over. That gives me x is equal to negative 2. For the x minus 2 is equal to 0, I'm going to add my 2 over. And that gives me x is equal to 2. So I have those 3 terms or 3 numbers that are solutions. You have negative 3, negative 2, and positive 2. For example B, you have 4x cubed minus 3x squared minus 16x plus 12 is equal to 0. Again, you have 4 terms on that left side of that equal sign, and this is equal to 0, so we are going to factor by grouping. Group the first 2 terms, group the last 2 terms. From the first 2 terms, you have an x squared, that's your like factor. From the last 2, it's negative 4. So that's going to give you x squared times 4x minus 3 minus 4 times 4x minus 3 is equal to 0. Your 2 sets of parentheses are identical, so you could rewrite this as x squared minus 4 times 4x minus 3 is equal to 0. So with the one before this, I factored that x squared minus 4 completely. For this one, I'm going to show you to where it's just set equal to 0, and then we use the square root method in order to solve. So that's going to give us x squared minus 4 is equal to 0, as well as 4x minus 3 is equal to 0. For the equation on the left, the x squared minus 4 is equal to 0. I'm going to add my 4 over to get that x squared is equal to 4. Then from there, I take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you're taking the square root of both sides, you put the plus or minus in front of your answer. So that means that x is equal to positive 2 and negative 2 from that equation only. From your 4x minus 3 is equal to 0, we're going to move the 3 over first by adding it to both sides. That gives us 4x is equal to 3. Then we're going to divide each side by the 4. And we have that x is equal to 3/4. So you have three solutions here, the positive 2, the negative 2, and the 3/4. For your first example here, you have x squared minus 9x plus 14 is equal to 0. Everything's on the same side, so find your factors of 14 that add up to be negative 9. You have negative 2 and negative 7 that equal negative 9. So this factors to give you x minus 2 times x minus 7 is equal to 0. Since this is completely factored from here, you're going to set each part equal to 0 and solve. So you're going to have x minus 2 is equal to 0 and x minus 7 is equal to 0. For your x minus 2 is equal to 0, add your 2 over. That gives you that x is equal to 2. For the x minus 7 is equal to 0, add your 7 over. That gives you that x is equal to 7. So you have two solutions here, one that is the 2, the other that's the 7. For number 2, you have 2x squared plus 4x plus 1 is equal to 0. You have all of your terms on the same side, and this is equal to 0. You do not have a greatest common factor. Your a is not 1, so multiply your a and your c. 2 times 1 is 2. There are no factors of 2 that add up to be 4. So because this cannot be factored, you have no solution for this one. For number 3, you have x squared minus 9x plus 14 is equal to 0. This is the same question as number 1, so don't work with it. You can just cross it out if you want to. For your number 4, though, you have 2x squared plus x is equal to 1. So with this one, it's not equal to 0, so we're going to move the 1 over first. So we're going to subtract it from each side. You have 2x squared plus x minus 1 is equal to 0. Everything's on the same side. You do not have a greatest common factor, so we are going to multiply our a and our c term because a is not 1. So 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Your factors of negative 2 that added to be positive 1 are 2 and negative 1. So this is going to give us 2x squared plus 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. Because we have 4 terms now, we're going to factor by grouping. From the first set, we factor out a 2x. From the other, we factor out a negative 1. So that's going to be written as 2x times x plus 1 minus 1 times x plus 1 is equal to 0. Your two sets of parentheses are identical to one another, so that gives you x plus 1 times 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. From here, set each set of parentheses equal to 0 and solve. For the x plus 1 is equal to 0, subtract your 1 over. You have x is equal to negative 1. For the 2x minus 1 is equal to 0, add your 1 over first. You have 2x is equal to 1. Then divide each side by the 2, and you have that x is 1/2. So two solutions for this one, the negative 1 and the 1/2. For number 5, you have 3x squared plus 5x minus 2 is equal to 0. All of your terms are on the same side. You do not have a greatest common factor, so multiply your a and your c since a is something other than 1. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. Your factors of negative 6 that add up to be positive 5 are negative 1 and positive 6. So this is going to give us 3x squared minus x plus 6x minus 2 is equal to 0. We're going to factor this by grouping. Factor out an x from the first, factor out a 2 from the second. That's going to give us x times 3x minus 1 plus 2 times 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. Two parentheses are identical, so that's 3x minus 1 times x plus 2 is equal to 0. Set these both equal to 0, and then solve. Move your 1 over, and the 3x minus 1 is equal to 0 by adding it to both sides. That's going to give you 3x is equal to 1. Then divide each side by the 3, and x is going to give you 1/3. For the x plus 2 is equal to 0, subtract your 2 over, and that gives you that x is also negative 2. For number 6, you have x cubed minus 2x squared minus 5x plus 10 is equal to 0. For this one, you have all of your terms on the same side. However, you have 4 terms. So you're going to factor this by grouping. So group the first 2 terms, group the last 2 terms. From the first 2, you have an x squared. That's the greatest common factor. From the last 2, you have a negative 5. So that's going to give you x squared times x minus 2 minus 5 times x minus 2 is equal to 0. Your 2 parentheses are the same. So that's going to give you x minus 2 times x squared minus 5 is equal to 0. Set both parts equal to 0 and solve them. You're going to have x minus 2 is equal to 0, and x squared minus 5 is equal to 0. From here, for the x minus 2 is equal to 0, add your 2 over. That gives you that x is equal to 2. For the x squared minus 5 is equal to 0, add your 5 over. That's x squared is equal to 5. Then take the square root of both sides. So remember, if you're taking the square root of both sides, you put the plus or minus in front of your answer, and that gives you x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 5 also. For number 7, you have 4x cubed minus 25x is equal to 0. For this one, you're going to factor out the greatest common factor first, since all of your terms are on the same side. Your greatest common factor from these two is x, so that's going to give you x times 4x squared minus 25 is equal to 0. This 4x squared minus 25 is a difference of squares, so you are going to factor that to give yourself x times 2x minus 5 times 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. So you have 3 parts here, and you're going to set all 3 parts equal to 0. So you're going to have x is equal to 0, 2x minus 5 is equal to 0, and 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. From here, solve them. The x is equal to 0, that's a solution. You don't have to move anything over. But the 2x minus 5 is equal to 0, add your 5 over first. You have 2x is equal to 5. Then divide each side by the 2. So that way you have x is equal to 5 over 2. For the 2x plus 5 is equal to 0, subtract your 5 over first. That gives you 2x is equal to negative 5. Then divide each side by the 2. So x is negative 5 over 2. So you have 0, positive 5 over 2, and negative 5 over 2 for this one. For number 8, you have x squared minus 4x is equal to x plus 6. You have an x squared here, you also have an x, so move everything to the same side. If you want to start by moving that x over, you can subtract it from both sides. You'd have x squared, that one doesn't cancel. This one cancels. X squared minus 5x is equal to 6. From here, you'd move your 6 over by subtracting it from both sides to get x squared minus 5x minus 6 is equal to 0. You just have x squared, not something times x squared. So you are going to find your factors of negative 6 that add up to be negative 5. That's going to give you 1 and negative 6. So that's factoring to give you x plus 1 times x minus 6 is equal to 0. Set both of those parentheses equal to 0 and solve them. Move your 1 over by subtracting it from both sides. So you have x is equal to negative 1. Move your 6 over by adding it to both sides, and that gives you x is also positive 6. All right, for number 9, you have x squared minus 4x is equal to 2x plus 7. So this one's just like the one before it. You're going to move the 2x over first, so subtract that from both sides. So x squared minus 6x is equal to 7. Then move your 7 over. Subtract it from both sides. That's x squared minus 6x minus 7 is equal to 0. Now this one, you still don't have anything in front of that x squared, so there's no number there. So just find your factors of your negative 7 that add up to be negative 6, and do it as x plus or minus a number times x plus or minus a number is equal to 0. Your negative 7 is 1 and negative 7 that add to give you the negative 6. So this factors to give you x plus 1 times x minus 7 is equal to 0. From here, you have x plus 1 is equal to 0, and x minus 7 is equal to 0. So just solve them. Just subtract your 1 over. You have x is equal to negative 1. Add your 7 over. You have x is equal to 7.